Official field reports. Unedited camera footage. Pure justice. You are watching Bodycam incident reports.
Get on the ground! Do not touch the vest! Get down!
Officer, your finger's on the trigger. I am not reaching for the vest.
Shut up! Drop to your knees or I will shoot!
This is a training vest. You do not have a target.
The footage you are watching is not a response to an active shooter. What you are witnessing is the catastrophic result of racial profiling, weaponized by a paranoid 911 call, ending with a heavily armed, terrified police officer aiming a loaded weapon at a man who was simply trying to get his morning workout in. Before we break down this constitutional disaster, let us know in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? We always read the comments to see where our audience is tuning in from. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's get into it. The incident began at 5:30 a.m. in Oak Creek Estates, an affluent, predominantly white suburban community. The morning was quiet, covered in a thick, cold autumn fog. Malik Cross, a 40-year-old resident of the neighborhood, was 3 miles into his morning run. A Marine Force recon veteran, who now works as a Department of Defense contractor, Malik maintained his combat fitness by running in a 40-pound Rogue fitness-weighted vest. It was made of thick black nylon, held together by heavy-duty straps, and filled with iron sand. As Malik ran, his rhythmic breathing cutting through the cold air, a local resident watched him from a bay window. The resident lingered at the glass, checking the empty street. They didn't see the steady, disciplined pace of a neighbor exercising. They saw a large black man in their wealthy subdivision, noticed the thick black nylon straps across his chest, and let their own assumptions fill in the blanks. The resident picked up the phone and dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? Yes, there is a very large black male running down Elm Street. He's wearing some kind of military tactical gear, like body armor. He looks aggressive, and he definitely doesn't live here. That single phone call set a lethal trap. 2 miles away, Officer Todd Jenkins received the dispatch. Jenkins had been on the force for 3 years. He had zero military experience and a documented history of escalating high adrenaline calls. When the dispatcher relayed the message, suspicious black male, running, possibly wearing tactical body armor, Jenkins primed himself for a gunfight. In his mind, he wasn't driving to investigate a suspicious person. He was driving to intercept an armed suspect. Jenkins sped into the foggy subdivision. As his cruiser rounded the curve near the park trail, he spotted a silhouette moving in the mist. He tapped his brakes, the heavy Ford Explorer slowing down as he engaged the A-pillar spotlight. The harsh white beam cut through the fog, pinning Malik Cross against the gray morning. To anyone looking closely, the context was obvious. Malik was wearing gray athletic shorts and running shoes. His t-shirt was soaked with sweat, and his breath plumed heavily in the cold air. But Jenkins wasn't looking for a runner. He was looking for the suspect from the radio. For a split second, Jenkins squinted through the windshield, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, the intense spotlight caught the thick, wet nylon straps across Malik's chest. The dispatcher's words snapped to the front of his mind. Tactical gear, body armor. His pulse spiked. The racial profile and the equipment merged into a single, terrifying hallucination. Jenkins' hand instinctively dropped to the grip of his holstered Glock. His brain screamed, threat. Jenkins slammed on the brakes, throwing the cruiser into park at a harsh angle. He completely abandoned his tactical training. He didn't use the engine block or the thick door of his Ford Explorer for cover. He stepped entirely out into the open, completely exposing himself. Before his boots even planted firmly on the wet asphalt, Jenkins drew his 9mm service weapon, punched it out with both hands, and leveled the tritium sights directly at Malik's chest. "Police! Stop right there! Get your hands in the air!" Jenkins screamed, his voice cracking with raw, unmanaged adrenaline. Malik Cross froze instantly. As a veteran who had survived actual combat zones, Malik's threat assessment instincts operated at a speed Officer Jenkins couldn't comprehend. Malik didn't look at the police badge. He looked at Jenkins' wide, panicked eyes. He looked at the slight tremor traveling up the officer's wrists, making the front sight of the pistol vibrate. And most terrifyingly, he looked at Jenkins' right index finger, slipped completely inside the trigger guard, resting heavily on the trigger itself. Malik realized in a fraction of a second that the greatest threat to his life wasn't a criminal. It was a terrified, undertrained cop who had already decided he was guilty. And if Malik made one sudden move, or even tried to slowly unbuckle the vest to prove his innocence, the officer's panic would inevitably result in a negligent discharge. Malik took a slow, calculated breath. He wasn't going to beg for his life. He was going to take psychological control of the weapon being pointed at his head. In law enforcement training, officers are taught to command a scene through presence and verbal authority. But what Officer Todd Jenkins was exhibiting in the foggy morning air wasn't authority. It was pure, unadulterated panic. His sympathetic nervous system had hijacked his brain, plunging him into the dangerous physiological state known as fight or flight. Jenkins was experiencing severe auditory exclusion and tunnel vision. He didn't hear the steady, quiet hum of his cruiser's engine. He didn't process the upscale residential homes surrounding them. His entire reality had shrunk to the size of the black nylon vest, strapped to the chest of the large black man standing 15 feet away. "Get on the ground! Do not touch the vest!" Jenkins screamed again, his voice echoing off the manicured lawns. His arms were locked out rigid, but the barrel of his Glock 19 traced small, nervous circles in the mist. Malik Cross did not drop to the ground. As a Force Recon veteran, Malik understood the physics of the human body better than the officer holding him at gunpoint. Malik was wearing 40 pounds of iron sand. If he attempted to drop to his knees or lie flat on the asphalt, the sheer weight of the vest would force his body to shift awkwardly. He would have to drop his hands to break his fall. To an officer already trapped in an adrenaline-soaked loop of confirmation bias, a sudden drop of the hands would look exactly like a suspect reaching for a weapon, or a detonator. Compliance, in this specific moment, was a death sentence. Instead, Malik engaged in extreme tactical stillness. He slowly raised his hands until they were exactly level with his shoulders. He kept his elbows slightly bent, his palms wide open and facing the officer. It was a posture that communicated zero aggression while keeping his hands entirely visible. "Officer," Malik said. His voice was low, resonant, and entirely stripped of emotion. He did not plead. He did not ask what was wrong. He stated a lethal fact. "Your finger is on the trigger." The statement hit Jenkins like a physical blow, but it didn't break his panic. In his 3 years on the force, Jenkins had dealt with suspects who ran, suspects who fought, and suspects who begged. He had never aimed his weapon at a man who looked down the barrel and calmly critiqued his trigger discipline. The cold professionalism of Malik's voice caused massive cognitive dissonance for Jenkins. It didn't fit the profile of the aggressive suspect from the 911 call, but rather than reassessing the situation, Jenkins doubled down on his fear. "Shut up!" Jenkins yelled, his breathing shallow and rapid. He took a hesitant, stuttering step backward, creating distance instead of closing it, a classic sign of an officer who feels entirely outmatched by a situation. "Drop to your knees or I will shoot." Malik kept his eyes locked firmly on the front sight post of Jenkins' pistol. He knew that the moment Jenkins tightened his grip, the knuckle of his index finger would whiten just before the 5.5-pound trigger pull broke. "I am not moving," Malik replied, delivering the words in short, clipped intervals to ensure the panicked officer could process them. "This is a training vest. I am unarmed. You do not have a target." The word target hung in the cold air. It was military terminology, deliberately chosen. Malik was speaking to Jenkins not as a civilian, but as a professional trying to walk a rookie off a ledge. He was trying to force Jenkins' brain to engage its logical center and actually look at what was in front of him. But Jenkins was too far gone. He looked at the thick black straps across Malik's chest and hallucinated the threat he had been dispatched to find. "Keep your hands away from the chest rig," Jenkins barked, his voice trembling so violently he could barely project. "Do not touch the detonator." Detonator. The word confirmed Malik's absolute worst fear. The officer didn't just think he had a gun. He thought he was wearing an explosive device. If Malik twitched, if he coughed, if he tried to slowly unbuckle the heavy straps to show the officer it was just fitness gear, Jenkins would fire. Malik stopped speaking. He stopped moving completely. He slowed his breathing, minimizing the rise and fall of his chest. He turned himself into a living statue in the middle of the street. Officer Jenkins, realizing that screaming commands was not forcing the suspect to the ground, felt his control of the scene slipping away. His left hand trembled violently as he briefly took it off his weapon. Without taking his eyes off Malik, Jenkins reached up to the radio mic clipped to his shoulder epaulette. "Dispatch, 3 Adam," Jenkins keyed the mic, his voice breathless and frantic. "Emergency traffic. I have a non-compliant suspect at Oak and Elm. Large black male, tactical gear, possible explosive vest. Start rolling every available unit." The radio call sealed the narrative. By broadcasting the phrase, "possible explosive vest," over the emergency frequency, Jenkins had just turned a quiet morning jog into a major tactical incident. Malik stood perfectly still in the fog, listening to the crackle of the officer's radio. He knew exactly what was about to happen next. In less than 3 minutes, the street was going to be flooded with adrenaline-fueled police cruisers, all expecting to find a terrorist holding a detonator. When Officer Todd Jenkins broadcasted the phrase, "possible explosive vest," over the emergency frequency, he didn't just escalate the stop, he fundamentally altered the reality of every officer responding to the scene. In police psychology, this is known as contagious fire or contagious panic. The incoming officers were no longer arriving to assess a situation. They were arriving to neutralize a terrorist. The wail of multiple sirens began to echo through the cold, foggy streets of Oak Creek Estates, growing louder by the second. Jenkins stood behind the open door of his cruiser, his Glock 19 still leveled at Malik Cross's chest. His breathing was ragged, his arms rigid. He was a man trapped in a feedback loop of his own terror, waiting for backup to save him from a threat he had entirely imagined. Malik remained frozen in the middle of the street, his hands raised perfectly level with his shoulders. The 40-pound weight of the iron sand inside the vest dug into his trapezoids, but he didn't shift his stance by a single millimeter. He knew that the next 90 seconds were the most dangerous. When the backup cruisers arrived, the adrenaline on the street would multiply exponentially. Malik needed to establish an objective record of the truth before the chaos hit. He couldn't speak to Jenkins. The officer was entirely unresponsive to logic. So, Malik spoke directly to the glowing red recording light on Jenkins' body camera. He didn't yell. He projected his voice with the calm, measured cadence of a man dictating a report. "For the record," Malik stated, his deep voice cutting through the distant wail of sirens. "My name is Malik Cross. I reside at 414 Elm Street, inside this subdivision." "Shut up! Don't move!" Jenkins screamed, his gun trembling. Malik ignored the outburst, keeping his eyes locked on the barrel, but continuing his verbal documentation. "I am on my morning run. I am completely unarmed. I am wearing a 40-pound Rogue Fitness weighted training vest. I am making no aggressive movements." By stating his address and the specific brand of his fitness gear, Malik was systematically dismantling the 911 caller's profile of the suspicious outsider. He was forcing the body camera microphone to capture the exact, undeniable reality of the situation, knowing that this audio would be the foundation of his civil rights lawsuit. "I said shut your mouth!" Jenkins yelled, stepping sideways as the screech of heavy tires signaled the arrival of the cavalry. 2 Ford police interceptors tore through the fog, their light bars flashing violently. They locked their brakes, sliding to a halt at aggressive angles, completely blocking the street. 4 officers poured out of the vehicles before the SUVs even settled on their suspensions. Weapons were drawn instantly. They didn't see a neighbor exercising. Infected by Jenkins' frantic radio call, they saw a massive black man wearing a black tactical rig, standing off against a terrified patrolman. "Get on the ground! Get on the fucking ground!" The lead backup officer roared, sprinting toward Malik with a taser drawn, while 2 others flanked him with service weapons raised. Malik knew the protocol for surviving a swarm. If a suspect braces for physical impact, a highly adrenalized police officer will interpret that muscle tension as active resistance. If you tense your arms to protect your face, you will be struck, tased, or shot. To survive the ignorance of the officers, the combat veteran had to simulate absolute kinetic collapse. As the officers closed the distance, screaming conflicting commands, Malik deliberately gave out his center of gravity. He didn't reach down to catch himself. He simply let the 40-pound vest drag him straight down onto the wet asphalt. He turned his head to the side to protect his jaw from the pavement and went entirely limp. 3 officers slammed into his back a split second later. A heavy knee drove viciously into Malik's shoulder blade, pinning him to the cold street. Rough, panicked hands grabbed his wrists, violently wrenching his arms behind his back. The steel ratchets of the handcuffs bit deeply into his skin, clicking shut with aggressive force. "Don't touch the rig! Secure his hands!" one of the officers yelled, his voice thick with adrenaline. "I got the vest! Peeling it off!" Another officer shouted. Rough hands fumbled with the heavy, sweat-soaked nylon straps across Malik's ribs. The thick plastic buckles snapped open. The backup officer yanked the heavy black vest off Malik's back and threw it several feet away. The vest hit the wet asphalt with a dull, heavy metallic thud. It didn't sound like plastic explosives. It didn't clatter like ceramic rifle plates or loaded magazines. It sounded exactly like what it was: thick canvas bags filled with iron sand. Malik lay pressed against the cold, wet pavement, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. The fog swirled around the flashing red and blue lights. Officer Jenkins leaned against the hood of his cruiser, gasping for air, lowering his weapon as if he had just survived a war zone. He had his suspect. The threat was neutralized. But as the heavy thud of the weighted vest echoed in the morning air, the adrenaline on the street began to evaporate. The violent takedown was over. And in the sudden, eerie quiet that followed, the responding officers were about to realize exactly what and who they had just assaulted. When an officer broadcasts a possible explosive vest over the radio, protocol dictates that the scene be frozen immediately. A perimeter must be established, and the bomb squad, EOD, must be called in. But when Sergeant Miller, a 15-year veteran and the shift supervisor, arrived on the scene 3 minutes later, his instincts immediately told him the narrative didn't match the environment. He threw his Ford Tahoe into park and stepped out into the fog. The street was bathed in the strobe of red and blue lights. He didn't see a tactical standoff. He saw Officer Jenkins leaning against his cruiser, chest heaving, his weapon finally holstered. 3 backup officers stood in a tense semicircle around a suspect who was face down on the wet asphalt, handcuffed behind his back. And 10 feet away, sitting isolated in the middle of the street, was the explosive device. "Keep back, Sarge! We don't know what's in the rig!" one of the younger officers yelled, holding his hand up. Sergeant Miller didn't stop walking. He drew his high-lumen tactical flashlight and shined the beam directly onto the black nylon object. He didn't see exposed wires. He didn't see ceramic ballistic plates or taped magazines. He saw thick, sweat-soaked canvas. He saw heavy-duty Velcro straps. And right across the center of the chest panel, illuminated brightly by the beam, was the laser-cut logo of Rogue Fitness. Miller walked right up to the vest. He reached down and grabbed the thick shoulder strap, pulling it upward. It was dead weight. As he lifted it, the distinctive dull crunch of iron sand shifting inside the nylon compartments echoed in the quiet street. The sergeant dropped the 40-pound vest back onto the asphalt with a heavy, harmless thud. He turned his flashlight off and looked slowly at Officer Jenkins. "Jenkins," Miller said. His voice wasn't loud, but the absolute chilling calmness in it made the backup officers physically step back. "What exactly is this?" Jenkins blinked, the adrenaline still clouding his perception. "Sarge, the dispatch call. The 911 caller said he had tactical gear. He was refusing to drop to his knees. He wouldn't take the vest off." "It is a weighted running vest," Miller interrupted, his voice dropping to a harsh, procedural monotone. He pointed down at Malik Cross. "He is wearing athletic shorts and running shoes. He is soaked in sweat." Miller took 2 steps toward his patrolman, closing the distance so his words wouldn't echo across the neighborhood. "If a white guy in Lululemon shorts was jogging down this street wearing this exact same vest, would you have drawn your service weapon?" Jenkins opened his mouth to answer, but the words died in his throat. The reality of the situation finally pierced through his panic. He looked at the fitness logo, then at the handcuffed man. The color drained completely from Jenkins' face. Miller didn't wait for an excuse. He walked over to where Malik was pinned to the pavement. "Sir," Miller said, kneeling down beside him. "Are you injured?" "I am uninjured," Malik replied, his voice still completely flat, procedurally documenting the moment. "My wallet is in my front right pocket. I suggest you look at it." Miller reached into the pocket of Malik's athletic shorts and pulled out a slim, sweat-dampened leather wallet. He flipped it open. The first thing the flashlight hit was a Department of Defense Common Access card, CAC. Sitting right behind it was a United States Marine Corps veteran ED, bearing the insignia of Force Reconnaissance. Sergeant Miller stared at the cards. He was holding the identification of an elite military veteran who had just been held at gunpoint and violently taken down in his own neighborhood by a terrified rookie who couldn't tell the difference between a bomb and a gym accessory. The liability was absolute. The racial profiling was undeniable, and every single second of this catastrophic failure was currently being recorded by the glowing body cameras strapped to the officers' chests. Miller closed the wallet. He pulled his metal handcuff key from his duty belt, reached down, and personally unclicked the heavy steel restraints, freeing the veteran's wrists. He stood up and turned to the responding units. There would be no cover-up. Any attempt to hide this would turn a civil rights lawsuit into federal criminal charges. The only option was absolute damage control. "Step back," Miller ordered the backup officers, his voice carrying the cold, absolute authority of a shift commander. "Do not mute your mics. Do not turn off your cameras. And nobody says another word about this stop until I notify the watch commander." In the real world, police accountability rarely looks like a dramatic arrest at the scene of the crime. The bureaucratic machinery of justice moves slowly, hidden behind union reps, internal affairs protocols, and the standard defense of split-second fear. But Officer Todd Jenkins had made a fatal miscalculation. He hadn't just profiled an innocent man. He had profiled a Tier 1 military veteran who knew exactly how to dismantle a police department's defense using their own body camera footage. There was no yelling or grandstanding on the wet asphalt that morning. Sergeant Miller simply ordered Jenkins back to the precinct, cleared the backup units, and personally drove Malik across the 3 blocks back to his home. The silence that followed, however, was entirely deceptive. Less than 48 hours later, the city's legal counsel received a preservation of evidence demand from one of the most aggressive civil rights law firms in the state. The notice wasn't just a standard complaint. It was a surgical dissection of the incident, specifically citing violations of the Fourth Amendment, unlawful seizure, and the 14th Amendment, equal protection. The lawsuit introduced a devastating legal concept for the city to defend against: the weaponization of race. When the chief of police and the city's risk management team sat down to review the unedited body cam footage, the illusion of good faith policing instantly evaporated. They didn't see a proactive patrolman responding to a legitimate threat. They watched Jenkins arrive on the scene, bypass every single tactical assessment protocol, and escalate to lethal force based on nothing more than the color of a man's skin and a piece of heavy nylon. The audio was even more damning. The chief listened to Jenkins screaming in uncontrolled panic, hallucinating a detonator. And in stark contrast, they heard Malik Cross, calm, restrained, and procedurally flawless, narrating his own innocence and the officer's negligence directly into the microphone. Malik's calculated compliance had trapped the department. Because of the veteran's extreme tactical stillness, the city's lawyers could not claim the suspect was resisting. They could not claim he made a sudden, threatening movement. Jenkins hadn't reacted to an action. He had reacted to a race-based hallucination. Faced with a multi-million-dollar civil liability and a massive public relations disaster, the department abandoned Officer Jenkins. They could not afford to let a jury see a panicked cop holding a decorated Force Recon veteran at gunpoint over a CrossFit vest. Within days of the incident, Jenkins was stripped of his badge and his police powers. He was placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending an expedited disciplinary board. 2 weeks later, he was formally terminated. The Internal Affairs report concluded that Jenkins had exhibited a catastrophic failure to manage stress and engaged in egregious racial profiling. His certification was permanently flagged, ensuring he would never wear a badge in that state again. The city settled the civil suit out of court for a highly substantial sum to avoid the public spectacle of a federal trial. More importantly, the police department was forced to implement binding changes to their dispatch protocols, requiring operators to rigorously screen suspicious person 911 calls to filter out racially motivated profiling before broadcasting them as tactical threats. But the most powerful consequence of the incident wasn't written in a legal settlement or a termination letter. It happened exactly 7 days later, at 5:30 in the morning. The cold autumn fog once again rolled through the manicured streets of Oak Creek Estates. Through the mist, a figure appeared. It was Malik Cross. He was running at his steady, disciplined pace. He was wearing gray athletic shorts, a sweat-soaked t-shirt, and strapped tightly across his chest was the exact same 40-pound black nylon Rogue fitness vest. The next week, Malik Cross ran the exact same route, in the exact same vest. Accountability isn't anti-police, it's pro-Constitution. If you made it to the end of this breakdown, let us know in the comments. Do you think the 911 caller should also face criminal charges for swatting, or does the blame fall entirely on the officer's lack of training? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next review.
Case analysis finalized. To stay updated with transparent operations, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you for choosing Bodycam Incident Reports.